So when we talk about the displays, we're talking about what you see in the viewfinder and what you see on the back LCD monitor. Let's go ahead and start with the viewfinder itself. So when you hold it up to your eye and you look through the viewfinder, the frame that you see, this is kind of cool, is 100% accurate. A lot of cameras are 98 or 95% accurate. So what you see in the frame is what is going to end up in the final picture. Next up, we have an option, and you don't necessarily see this unless you have this turned on under image size in the shooting menu, is you can do a 1.3 crop with the DX sensor. Now this ends up being about a 2 times crop if you compare this with a full frame sensor. And the reason that you would want to do this is if you want to go from 6 frames per second to 7 frames per second. So for sports photography. Now you are not going to get 24 megapixels. I don't know the exact number, but you're going to be cutting that down probably to around 16 to 18 megapixels if you are using the 1.3 crop area. But it could be handy for those times when you need a little extra reach and just a little faster firing on the frames per second. Next up, the focusing points, and we just kind of talked about this before our break. In the last section, we have the 51 different focusing points. Whatever ones are active and which ones you're using are the ones that are going to light up for you to see. We have a grid pattern that kind of fits around all this other stuff. Some people like a grid pattern so that they can align vertical lines, get the level correct. And so this is very popular with landscape photographers and architectural photographers. And it's something that you can choose to turn on and off in the custom menu D2. We'll get to that when we get in the full menu system. And then we have something called the roll indicator. And this lets you know if you are tilting the camera left or right. Now, one of the things to note about this, unlike other Nikon cameras, both of these are not on at the same time. So they're not doing both up and down and tilting left to right. They're only doing, if I get this correct, the tilting left to right. And so if you turn the camera vertically, it switches from one, and horizontal, it switches to the other. And this can be activated with shortcut buttons. And you can go into the custom menu and assign maybe the function button on the front of the camera, which is this little function button right up here. And so, or actually the function button is down here. So when you press this button down here, the roll indicator would come on. And so it's a personal preference whether you like something like that or not. I tend to want to keep a clean frame in the viewfinder for most of the things that I'm doing. Now there's a number of warnings that you should be aware of if you have the camera in that particular mode. The camera will alert you to those warnings if, for instance, and we'll kind of go from bottom left counterclockwise around, if you have forgot to put a memory card in the camera, if you are in a black and white only mode, you wouldn't want to be shooting color, and you wouldn't want to be shooting black and white if you thought you were shooting color. If you have the camera set to the effects mode, if you remember there was the color sketch and a bunch of other goofy things that you could do with your camera, it warns you that you are doing it. And then finally, the 1.3 crop, if you are actually only getting a smaller portion of the area, it does outline it, but just to make it really clear to you, it also has a little warning in the little upper right-hand corner on that. And then finally, down at the bottom, we have, actually for Nikon, a new LED info. It's been kind of greenish yellow for many, many, many years, and now it's just slightly off-white. A little bit brighter, a little bit easier to see, a little better detail on it. And you'll never see it look like this, hopefully, because if you do, there's probably a problem with your camera. It's kind of the entirety of what might be seen in the viewfinder, but we're just going to kind of go through this real quickly left to right. The white dot indicates that your picture is in focus. If you see one of the arrows, that is the direction the lens needs to be turned in which to focus. And so if it says this direction, you can just turn the lens manually that direction if you are manually focusing in order to get proper focus. If you're autofocusing, they might just blink in the fact that they're changing. Next up, we've got the auto exposure lock and the flash exposure lock. You remember the AEL button on the back of the camera? When you press and hold that button, this will come on. And you can, if I recall correctly, we'll see this in a little bit, you can actually change the parameters of that button. So rather than pressing and holding, you can tap the button once and it stays locked in. And so some people prefer to have it locked or just a press and hold, and that lets you know that that button is pressed. We also have the flash value lock. If you do a test flash, you can lock that value in for the next picture. It's a little bit more of a feature of the flash than the camera itself. The X-Sync, we referred to this earlier in the X-Sync on this camera, is the 250 shutter speed at the end of the shutter speed dial. It just means that your camera is locked into 2/50th of a second. Next up, we'll have our shutter speeds. To note for the beginners, it will indicate with the two little hash marks to the side if it is in full seconds. So if it's 2, with a little quotation, that means 2 seconds. If the quotes aren't there, the 2 would indicate 1/2 of a second. And so most of the shutter speeds that you'll be working with are fractions. Next up, we have our apertures. And after that, we have our light meter, also known as the exposure level. And you'll notice in the example that you see here, it says plus on both sides of the 0. This is not a mistake on my part. Nikon has been going through some unusual times trying to figure out which side of the 0 the plus should be on. And it can be switched around. The way the camera comes from the factory, the plus is on the right side, the minus is on the left side, and I believe this is the first camera from Nikon that has done that. And so if you're used to old Nikons, you'll be able to customize this, and you'll see this when we get into the custom menu. For the most part, you don't need to worry about it right now. Next up, we have our battery level and our flash exposure compensation, and then we have our bracketing and exposure compensation. So you want to be aware if any of these are turned on. That means your camera is doing something funny with the exposure. Now, I did recommend for a lot of people to just leave the flash exposure compensation somewhere in the -2/3 to -1 stop territory, and so that might be on all the time if you've chosen to make that setting. We then have our ISO or our shots remaining. Depends on what you have set in the menu setting, and so I'm going to recommend when we get there changing it over to ISO because I think that's a more important setting than the shots remaining. If you see a K, it means you have more than 1,000 images. So if you saw 2.3K, it means you have 2.3 thousand pictures or 2,300 pictures left. And it's just Nikon's way of giving you an estimate of how many pictures are remaining. And then finally, there is a flash warning light that comes on whenever it's low light and you need flash or additional light. And for some of the more advanced users, that little warning light is a nuisance because they know they need light, but they are trying to do a particular type of shot and they're not worried about it. So you can actually turn off that warning as well. And so that's something we'll see when we get into the custom menu. Now let's jump back to the screen itself on the camera. First off, you can hit the info button and that turns on the lovely display. This is a new display and they have a little different look to it, which looks quite nice. And so just hitting the info button will bring out all that information on the back screen, which is just helpful for your basic camera settings. If you hit the I button to the left, what it does is it allows you access to the bottom 2 rows of settings. And a lot of these settings we are going to see duplicated in the menu, so we're not going to discuss them all here. There are ones, and unfortunately, now if Nikon wanted to improve this camera, here's my suggestion on how to improve it. Allow you to customize what goes into this info screen. Right now, of the 10 or 12 things they have in there, I find 2 or 3 as really valuable. And I would love to be able to switch out what they have in there. But you can't do that at this time. They have a preset selected number of items that you can go to change in there. So let's talk about the top of the screen first. These are obviously your basic settings. And they're just going to change as you change shutter speeds, apertures, and so forth on the camera. Over on the left-hand side, you can see more information exactly about what file sizes you're storing, RAW, JPEG, for instance, and what you're doing to each card. Card number 1, which is the top card, or card number 2. Throughout the rest of the area, you're going to see basically a whole bunch more of information. General settings will be seen in here, your light metering, you see the battery level indicator, how many shots remaining in your ISO, and very importantly, which focusing point you have selected. Can't tell you how many times I've been working with somebody with a camera and they have either the left or the right focusing point activated, and they're having a hard time focusing because they think they're in the center, but it's actually off to the side. And so just keep check of what focusing point you have activated. Now, down at the bottom, the I button will allow you to go in and change these features down here. For instance, we have the image area, so if you want to do that 1.3 crop, you could kind of take this shortcut and change it right here. We're going to go ahead and not talk really about these right here, but we're going to go ahead and just go into the menu system where we'll discuss them in depth. The ones that I see valuable in here, let's see, what do I see? You can program your function button, which is kind of nice. And other than that, there's really nothing in here that at least I use on a really regular basis, but you might find something in there that you do change back and forth, and it's going to be faster to do it here than it is actually diving in to the entire menu system. And then when you want to turn it all off, you can just hit the info button and it turns it all off.